magnificent structure. So thank you so much for coming along. And this is a live recording for our podcast, which is called A Nation of Taxpayers, live from the think tent at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester. What a marvellous audience you are. Thank you. So thank you very much for coming along. I'm your host. I'm Duncan Barks. I host the TaxPayers Alliance podcast called A Nation of Taxpayers. You can find it on YouTube, Apple Podcasts and Spotify. It's the best thing out there. It's a proper centre-right podcast. None of this centrist dad stuff that appears to be polluting the podcast world. So if you haven't yet subscribed to it, please do. We publish something every week featuring fabulous guests, like the one who's to my left and to your right is our Shadow Chancellor, Sir Mel Stride, also the MP for Central Devon. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And we also have John O'Connell, who's Chief Executive of the TaxPayers Alliance.
Hey.
And we are streaming this live on YouTube, so if you're watching on YouTube, hello and thank you for logging on. Now, over the next 30 minutes, we'll have a bit of a chinwag about Sir Mel's big announcement yesterday. We'll talk about some Conservative Party policies, and then you'll get the opportunity after about 30 minutes to answer some questions. I'll say this now, we'll try and get as many questions in as possible. What tends to happen with these events is you get a few questions to begin with, the momentum builds, and then at the end, you've got a load of hands up, and I'm in a really difficult position where I have to let people down, and I do not like letting people down. So we'll try and get as many people asking questions as we can. But first off, Mel, your conference speech yesterday, entitled Responsible Radicalism. Great title. £47 billion in savings over the next Parliament. How are you going to achieve it?
So, well, let's start with why it's necessary. It's necessary because our indebtedness, the servicing costs on our debt and so on just add up to a disaster somewhere further down the line. And we need to get on top of it. And we need to be the party that demonstrates very clearly that we stand for fiscal responsibility and we are going to have our country living within its means. To your specific question, 47 billion, a lot of that is around welfare, and that is around getting down the kind of spiralling costs there are around the sickness, disability space within welfare, and in particular making sure that those that have mild mental health challenges around mild depression, anxiety, etc., are not automatically, in many cases, taken onto benefits, but actually move towards the world of work, which we think is important because we think that work should be central to any welfare system, and in many cases is the best kind of approach to treating some of the conditions that those people have, you know, the routine, the pride of work and so on. Some other elements of it come from reducing the size of the civil service, which grew by 37% or thereabouts between 2016 and the present day, partly driven by COVID and Brexit and a need to have more civil servants, but those things aren't there anymore. The state functioned reasonably well back in 2016. It wasn't falling apart. There's no reason why we can't get it back to the size that it was over the 5-year period of a parliament. And what all this will do is give us the ability to get debt down, which is absolutely essential, but equally to look at things such as tax and lowering taxes in order to get growth going in our country.
We pay around £105 billion a year alone to service our debt interest. How did we end up in this situation?
There was a combination of factors. We inherited in 2010 a very high deficit. It was then about 160 billion. That's the amount that's being added to the debt each year, or it was about 11% of GDP at that time. And during the 2010 up to about COVID period, actually, we started getting that deficit down to the point that we were actually, or virtually eliminated the deficit by the time COVID struck. Now, when COVID struck, of course, the big fear then was that the impact on the labour market would be devastating. Unemployment would go up at least to the levels it was in the 1980s or beyond. We stepped in through furlough, bounce back loans, etc., to prevent that from happening. The political climate, if you remember at the time, was to actually urge us on to do ever more. All these groups that weren't getting support should be getting support. The whole thing cost about £400 billion, and that added to the debt. And that therefore required a fiscal response further down the line in terms of accommodating the fact that that debt will have to be paid off and fed into the sort of fiscal targets and so on. So that was a tough thing to have to handle. What has happened since we left office, of course, is this government has, well, it's done several things. One is killed growth through putting taxes on businesses in particular, but it has also borrowed vast amounts of money, which has stoked inflation, kept inflation high, and has required interest rates to be higher for longer as a consequence. And the combination of that adding to the debt that the government's doing at the rate of knots and the higher interest that's being paid leads you to the £105 billion that you cited, which is about twice what we spend on defence. If debt servicing costs were a government department, it would be the third highest spending department in government. But all we're doing is paying creditors for lending us money. And the trajectory on that servicing cost, actually, according to the OBR, is it will rise to 130 billion by the end of the scorecard period in the next 5 years. So there is a real job to be done to tackle that. But to answer your questions of how we got there, that's broadly how it happened. What we now need to do is what we were doing before, which is get the deficit down, get the debt down, and get on top of it.
Okay. The £47 billion figure, the savings amount that you wish to achieve, it'll be music to the ears of everyone in our think tent and a lot of people watching and listening to our podcast. We're going to use that word radical again. It does require you, when you become Chancellor, being remarkably radical. Are we looking at Britain's version of Argentina's melee? Where's your chainsaw?
Yeah, there's no chainsaw. I think I'd be personally very dangerous if I was. I'd probably take both my arms off ingeniously with a single chainsaw. But anyway, so I don't think that's the way to see me. But yesterday I made a very serious down payment and a very serious statement of intent in a political field where nobody is doing that. Okay, Labour aren't talking about getting on top of government spending. In fact, they're incapable of doing it. Reform are talking about, scrapping the two-child benefit limit or cap, which of course will cost billions of pounds more on welfare and so on. So we're the only people that are doing this, and we absolutely have to do it. So when it comes to Millet or whatever, where I do identify with that approach, is the seriousness of intent of getting on top of government spending.
Yep.
And indeed, we will be looking at other areas over the coming months and years.
Okay. There are a couple of challenges, aren't there? Because you're going to have to convince voters again, after 14 years of a Conservative government, that they can trust you once again with the economy.
So one of the reasons why I think we have ended up in that position with the economy is both the challenges we face that I've also set out around both COVID that I spoke about, but also the cost push price inflationary pressures that came on the heels of the Ukraine-Russia war, which took inflation up to over 11% and had to be dealt with. And there's nothing I think that we could have done other than deal with it. They were externalities that visited us rather than being problems of our own making. However, the mini budget at the back end of 2022 was a mistake. Not in its intent, which was to get taxes down and drive growth, and that is absolutely a way of driving growth, and you've seen some of the evidence of me setting that out yesterday morning. But certainly in terms of those tax cuts being unfunded at that point, that was what led to the problems. And if you think of Margaret Thatcher and Nigel Lawson, who also worked hard to get taxes down, in fact, the big dragon that needed slaying in 1979 was inflation. And in terms of the sequence of events, it was getting the public finances under control, inflation under control, and then coming in with the tax cuts. And that's why Nigel Lawson was so effective at what he did. And that was the mistake we made in the back end of 2022. I've spoken about it before. I gave a speech at the Royal Society of Arts about 3 months ago or so now, in which I made it very clear that mistakes were made. I said that at the time that it happened. I was chair of the Treasury Select Committee, so I've been very consistent on that. And it's important that the public knows, and I said this in my speech yesterday, that make no mistake, we are the party of fiscal responsibility. In a political world in which Labour are messing up the economy, Reform will promise anything with no plan as to how they're going to deliver it, we are the grown-ups that will be there to do the right things by the economy, including getting taxes down and also dealing with the debt.
Okay, and a final question about the challenge that you might face regarding that. Are you prepared to take on the unions? Are you prepared to take on the mental health charities who will, understandably, because that's their job, kick off about the proposals you've outlined?
So I think in terms of the expression take on, I'm less comfortable with. Look, what we need to do, we're not out there to just willy-nilly take people on, but we are there when it comes to public sector pay, for instance, to make sure that there are productivity gains to be had around those arrangements. And one of the critical errors that this government made on coming to office was to give the train drivers 14%, to give junior doctors 22%, and have no productivity strings attached, rather naively thinking that by doing that everybody would go away and it would all be fine. And of course it wasn't. They're all coming back for more, and productivity has not improved as a result of that investment. We have to be relentlessly focused on growth and productivity as well, and that is where that is the answer to your question, really.
Okay, thank you, John.
So, Mel, you mentioned that we shouldn't see you as melee. How should we see you? Because
I meant melee in the sense of running around with a chainsaw.
Sure,
I mean, I should be seen as a person that is serious about living within our means.
Absolutely, and you've outlined a very detailed, specific plan, which at the TPA we've long been calling out for politicians to finally spell out what it is that needs to be done. But I suppose what I meant from my original question was, I'm sort of interested in what shapes and drives your philosophy, the philosophical underpinnings of how you see the economy.
Okay, so I think let me not get too highfalutin about it, but just make an obvious observation. If you look at the Office for Budget Responsibilities, fiscal sustainability and risk forecast, which looks at where the economy is going in terms of debt to GDP ratio over the next decades or so. That line is rising in a way which is totally and utterly unsustainable. So we have a debt to GDP ratio at the moment, it's a measure of our debt against the size of the economy, of near on 100%. In the Second World War, it was about 250%, and that's the highest it's ever been. Well, that line goes up through 200, 250, 300, 4, 5, 6, etc. There is a point on that line, okay? We don't know where it is exactly, but there is a point on that line at which all the wheels come off, terrible things happen to our economy, and everybody suffers as a consequence. So we've got to avoid that. And what that means, therefore, is that we've got to get on top of that debt, on top of that servicing cost, and grow the economy. Because if the underlying assumption that drives the slope of that line to some degree on growth were increased and doubled, and it's a fairly anemic assumption, that line wouldn't be like that, it would be as flat as a pancake. So growth is the way out of the challenges of the future. So to my philosophy, I say let's get growth going, let's look at every aspect of our economy, including tax, and have it lean relentlessly into growth. And if we can then do that, then we can face into those kind of challenges that we will otherwise face.
Okay, thank you. And staying on spending, it's very easy. It's a political truism. We were saying this in the last panel for those who were here, that it's a political truism that it's very easy to give stuff to people, but very difficult to take it away. So you've laid out quite a robust series of welfare changes, for instance. The political and sort of the communications challenge further down the line is telling the presenter of the Today programme, no, we actually are going to take that away from people, because they will find the sort of case-led media of the one person who's going to lose out, and it's time to get serious about trade-offs, presumably.
It's time to get serious about the debt and serious about living within our means, and that means tough decisions in some cases. The duty of our party is to be honest with the public about that, but it's also to win that argument and to keep fighting that argument, because if we don't win it, we will end up in a bad place, in my opinion. Another argument that we have got to win is that better public services do not require ever-increasing amounts of cash being tipped into them. You can look at the way things are done, efficiencies and productivity that we've just touched on, particularly in a rapidly evolving AI environment in which there are huge opportunities for public sector efficiencies. We have to win certain arguments if we're to do the right thing by the country.
And does that involve what are seen as sacred cows, things like reforming how the healthcare system works, things like that?
Okay, so we've not said anything about healthcare reform, and there's nothing that I'm here tonight to talk about. I can really talk about what we've gone out with our policy development work in areas like tax and like government spending and some other areas too. Yeah.
You talk about tough decisions. I think there's an elephant in the room. Where do you stand on the triple lock? Are you prepared to review the triple lock? because I was talking to some younger voters the other day, and it seems to be a reoccurring theme. I think they call them Zoomers, where there's this animosity that seems to exist in some quarters, where the younger voter look at the older generation and think they have it all, and they're having a couple of cruises a year, and they're shopping at Waitrose every night for their tea and that kind of stuff, because they have the triple lock. Is there an argument to say if you want to appeal to a new generation of Conservative voter, you have to at least look at the triple lock, review it, and potentially amend it?
So on the triple lock, we have no plans to change the triple lock.
Right.
I have to be really clear about that. I think people have too readily overlooked where we were with pensioner poverty under the last Labour government. We had the 4th highest level of pensioner poverty in Europe, and it is things like the triple lock and other things that we did that radically changed that. In fact, we reduced pensioner poverty by 200,000 in absolute poverty terms after housing costs. And you've got to bear in mind that pensioners are unable, like working age people, to simply change their economic circumstances by getting a job, changing their job, or whatever it may be. But I don't think it's mutually exclusive to be able to do the right thing for younger people as well as looking after older people. And looking after younger people is about actually growing the economy. So you can, if you have an economy in which real wages are growing much faster because the economy and growth and productivity are increasing, then people will be earning more. We have slid in since the global financial crisis 2008 to a lower growth of real wages, and that has disproportionately affected younger people. And what I said yesterday was actually to set out from some of the savings that I presented an offer to younger people on housing. So that first £5,000 of the national insurance that they are due to pay on that first job should actually go into an ISA and be there as a deposit against a future property. And if you had 2 people, a couple working, then that would be £10,000. And I think that's an important thing, both as a down payment to younger people, to show them that we're in that space and wanting to do the right thing with them. And at the same time, I think it's an economically important thing to show that where you reduce taxes, where you, in this case, hypothecate taxes for other things to the benefit of people, you can actually generate more output because it will encourage people into employment, particularly in that first job environment. And I think younger people, it is a question of the experience of lower real wages. It's also an experience of being saddled up with debt, often with university courses that are not actually providing sufficient value added to justify taking on that debt. And it's also about the asset price inflation that people probably from the early 40s and older benefited from, but those who are younger than that age did not benefit from. So it's a big piece of work, I think, around intergenerational fairness that is very much at the front of my mind, and that's why I press very hard on that particular aspect in my speech yesterday.
Okay, so there's an offer to the younger voter, but just revisiting the triple lock question, because I think it's something that is gaining momentum. Do you generally think it's sustainable?
So, as I say, on the triple lock, all I have to say about the triple lock is that it is not something that we are planning to make changes to.
Yeah, a theme that's coming through in some of what you're talking about with spending and public service reform and this kind of thing is complexity, and of course another element of the economy that's particularly complex is the tax system. Do you have, I'm sure you're not going to reveal specific policy now, but general views on how that's happened, how we've got to a state where we have a tax code that's grown from 11,000 pages in 2010 to something like 25,000 pages now, and the sort of general view on how to fix that in the longer term.
So, there's a lot there. So, a few observations on tax. You're absolutely right. We've got a huge tax code, and the Hong Kong tax code apparently is written on a postage stamp or something similar. It's very small and so on and so forth. We do need to get that complexity down. We need to simplify the tax system because there are distortions within it that should ideally be ironed out, particularly when they lean into discouraging economic activity. So, for example, if you take income tax, the interaction of the benefit system and that's tax can lead to very high marginal tax rates. So child benefit, when it's withdrawn between, I think, £50,000 and £80,000 worth of earnings, leads to, if you've got 3 children, something like a 75% marginal tax rate. If you look at within the income tax regime itself, once you get to 100,000, the personal allowance is tapered away, and you get very high marginal tax rates between about 100 and 125,000 or thereabouts. So each of those things creates cliff edges which make people think, do you know what, it's not worth earning any more than this, I'll stop working, and so on. So those are things which we do need to be ironing out. Now, what's the problem and why hasn't it happened is that some of those things actually raise significant amounts of money. So to unwind the withdrawal of the personal allowance above 100,000, I think the figure is of the order of £5 billion. It's a very pretty hefty price tag. That's getting on for double the cost of making that big bold offer to young people that I made yesterday. So these things don't come cost-free, and I think we should never lose sight of that. Laffer effects. I went to Nashville about a month ago now, and I met with Arthur Laffer in his home, and he was absolutely charming, delightful, and we talked about his theories around tax and so on. And I'm persuaded by a lot of it. I think there are taxes out there where you could reduce the rate and increase the yield, or at least not deplete the yield. And I think there are things that are about wealth creation often. So the higher rate of capital gains tax, for example, particularly when people can control when they fall due to it by deciding when they offload assets, is probably an area which has Lafferish effects to it. I think SDLT stamp duty has a similar element to it. It's transaction-based tax. It stops transactions which trigger the tax payment, and therefore, if you drop the rate, you might expect to get more. And I think there are some duties actually that fall into that category. For example, on cigarettes, where duty is at a level that counterfeiting and smuggling kicks in, and you undermine the tax base that way. Not for a moment that I am suggesting that we go easy on duty on cigarettes, but just by way of example. But the overall the final thing I was going to say was, of course, if you get the overall tax environment and the tax burden too high, particularly on wealth creators, you shouldn't be surprised if they leave the country. And 16,000 have in the last year, it's estimated, millionaires up to billionaires left the country. And the problem with that, although the socialists may say, oh, good riddance, etc., if you're not going to pay your fair share, whatever that means, is that other people have to pick up the tax burden that they're not covering. And the answer to the question as to how many people on average earnings you would need to pay the tax of the 16,000 that walked out the door is something probably between a third to 500,000 people. So we have to be very aware of looking after the wealth creators. We have to be very aware of having a tax environment that means that people want to kick the door down to get in here and invest, and stay, rather than eyeing the door up to find the quickest way out. And the final thing I'd say on tax is that, as with all other areas within the economic sphere, we must always look at it through the lens of business and growth. Wealth creation, job creation, that is the way forward for our country for the reasons that I outlined earlier. Growth is the way through the challenges that we have, and tax lies absolutely at the centre of that.
No, fair point. And just to, you mentioned the trade-offs of making tax changes, such as the cliff edge around income of 100,000 and the withdrawal of the personal allowance, and the cost to that being roughly 5 billion. Then somebody might argue, okay, but if you smooth that out, then actually a family might have more money to spend, so you might get more VAT receipts, etc., etc. The so-called dynamic effects of tax changes, as opposed to static effects. With credit to the OBR, which is something I rarely do, but credit to the OBR, they've now actually started to introduce dynamic scoring into their modelling a bit more. Is that something that needs to be done even more, as it were? Because we can look at this 10-year dynamics of tax changes, what it means for growth, jobs, productivity, as opposed to what it means for next year's receipts.
Absolutely. We need to look at the overall impact within the modelling on the economy, the fiscal position, the tax take, all the big moving parts. And as you say, the OBR has been looking at moving a little bit more in that direction, and that is a good thing. We have to be sympathetic with the OBR in the sense that if you take my example of the 16,000 people that have left and the impact that is having, it's a very high impact and a very small number of people. And when you get into those kind of calculations, actually, it's sometimes difficult to know what the behavioural effects are. Say it's not 16,000, the estimate's wrong, it's actually only 5,000, and that has enormously different impacts just over a small number of people concerned. So some of these judgments are very difficult, but I think you're absolutely right. You have to look at the second order consequences of some of these changes. That needs to be built into the models. Economics, as you know, is one of those sciences that makes astrologers are there to make economists look good, they say. So that's the kind of nature of the challenge. Yeah.
A couple of things we need to nail this evening, if it's okay, and you must call me out if I'm misquoting you here, because this was from the Guido Fawkes website, so I'm more than happy.
Got to be true.
It's got to be true.
Yeah.
You were talking at an Onward event earlier today, and this was the quote: "If I was in exactly her position," this is Chancellor Rachel Reeves, "and I had to deal with tax, and I was down the end of the spectrum where the black hole was really big, I would probably go for income tax. I wouldn't want to be in that position, but that's the cleanest thing to do." Some people might go, oh, Tories, if they get in, they're going to raise income tax.
So the journalist, of course, will rush out and say, Stride calls for X, Y, Z. Yep. You have to contextualise those comments. It was a comment about if we were having a black hole that was the size that the National Institute of Economic and Social Research suggests it might be, which is 42 billion, and then she's got to add some headroom. I mean, just eye-watering 50 billion. I made the observation that that would probably lead her into having to look at the heavy lifting taxes, those being VAT, national insurance, and income tax. And then I just talked about where she would possibly go. But in no way am I out there urging the government to do anything that the headlines might suggest.
Understood.
Who knows?
And there's one more. We have a Taxpayers Alliance supporter by the name of Michael, who, when I said we were interviewing you here at the conference, he said, you've got to ask him about a wealth tax. And I said, I'm sure Mel Stride's not interested in the wealth tax. This goes back to 2021, when I think you were doing an interview on Times Radio off the back of the pandemic. Yeah, Michael knows his stuff. And it was suggested, and Reuters covered it, a one-off wealth tax might be a way for Rishi Sunak at the time to plug the hole in the country's public finances. You were described as an influential lawmaker, chair of Parliament's Treasury Committee. You said that other countries such as France and Switzerland had introduced wealth taxes only to row back on them later. And this was the quote: "I think what might be more promising in terms of effectively raising more tax might be a one-off wealth tax."
No, that doesn't mean so I'm advocating, I'm sorry. Right. So the point that I was making, which was contained in the Treasury Select report on tax, that was a cross-party report, was a simple observation that A, in my view, wealth taxes are an extremely bad thing, and I've just identified why you don't want to drive people away from this country. But B, the obvious observation that countries that have tried this have found that the only way they ever get anything out of it is to go in straight away, have a one-off grab, which I think is a very dubious and wrong thing to do, and that if you take a longer-term approach to it, ongoing, people just leave and move, and the actual tax tails away. And that's why a number of European countries have tried wealth taxes and ended up rowing back from them and giving up on it. So, but in no way would those remarks have been Mel Stride saying, bring on wealth taxes, far from it. In fact, in the committee, there was a lot of discussion around the Conservative view that they were an extremely bad thing, and the Labour view on the committee that they were an extremely good thing. But there is a distinction between a one-off raid and a longer-term thing in terms of their sustainability, but they are both deeply bad things to do.
Okay. Those are the end of my nasty questions. So I can't speak for the audience, who we'll get to in a second. I just thought we'd ask some nicer questions. Your wild water swimming. Have you been taking a dip in the Manchester Canal recently? What's the...
No, I'm not sure I want to. I mean, is it safe to swim around in the Manchester Canal? No, I love cold water swimming, particularly the colder the better. I swim in water where you've had to have broken the ice before you get in, which means it's about 2 degrees. And I find that when you reach that moment just before hypothermia sets in, and one of the symptoms, incidentally, that you should get out is you start to feel all warm and wonderful about the world, that's the time to get out. But I find it good for mental health and mental clarity, and I enjoy doing it. Yeah.
And I was reading you have an unpublished novel knocking around in a bottom drawer of a desk somewhere. What's it about?
Well, it's set in 1960s America and the music scene over there at that time, and it's.
Is that a particular interest of yours?
I spent some time in Texas in particular, and California, learning how to fly, which is one of the other things that was in that little list of things that people don't perhaps know about me, and pilot's license and all the rest of it. And I've always been attracted by American literature in particular, Hemingway and. Faulkner and others, and so that was the kind of place I went.
Are you looking for a publisher?
Well, interestingly, now it's become public, and it's even more public now that you've asked me. I have had a few nibbles as people who might be interested in seeing, said
manuscript.
But so hopefully it'll be a blockbuster by Christmas.
Fantastic news. Let's get some questions from our audience. We have a couple of roving microphones. Please put your hands up high. These lights are quite glaring, so I need to be able to squint properly. I think we'll go to the front row down there, please. Thank you. And if you could say who you are, sir, and what your question is, and obviously you've got Mel and you've got John who can answer it. Yes, please.
Okay. So, I'm Graham. I'm from Norwich. Just on the question of getting the debt down, obviously going back to Margaret Thatcher's day, apparently they introduced something where they had a minister who oversaw everything the civil servants put through, and then he kept declining it, and he agreed to go to the Treasury what was necessary. Would you be prepared to do something like that, just to really radically get the debt down? That kind of makes sense.
Yeah, it comes back, Mel, to how radical you're prepared to be to take on the civil service and whatnot.
You hear a lot about the blob when people talk about the civil service, and it's often to explain why government has been thwarted from doing something. I was Secretary of State at the Department of Work and Pensions for a while at the end of our last term in office. And my observation was actually that, yes, there were people that would try and thwart what you were trying to do, but it came down to you and your leadership to cut through that. And if ministers are good at what they do, whilst it's difficult, for example, to have somebody who you consider to be underperforming removed from the civil service, that's down to the civil service apparatus, you can easily get them moved to another place fairly quickly. And I found where I had resistance to things, and I have to say my working relationship with civil service was pretty good, that we were able to get a huge amount done. Welfare reform, for example, to the work capability assessment, that's a gateway into some of these sickness and disability benefits that the OBR themselves said meant 450,000, almost 500,000 fewer people going on to those benefits, and multi-billion pound savings as a consequence. So you can get things done. So I think that in turn leads into, what should the approach be to having the right sort of human resource around you such that you can make sure that these blockages are unblocked. And I think that's an interesting area that we're thinking about.
Thank you. More questions, please. Gentleman down here in the white shirt, the rather nifty tie. Thank you, sir. What's your name?
Andrew Brannan from Richmond Park.
Thank you.
Mel, on one of our many holidays this year, courtesy of the Triple Lock, you went to Singapore, and I believe there they have a system of like an individual social security account. So when you pay your national insurance there, it goes into your own account and it grows, and then if you need some for university fees, you take some out, then it put more and more in. Then when you get older, maybe a bit of healthcare, and then it's there for your pension. And what you announced yesterday seemed like a step along the road of something like that. Now, when you and I were born, Mel, Singapore was a basket case. Today, it's one of the fastest growing, most dynamic economies in the world. And they're doing a lot of things right. And I think, although nothing is replicable entirely, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from what they're doing in Singapore, including this personal account, which not only would probably be a lot cheaper, but would also engender personal responsibility amongst all our taxpayers.
Yeah. So, look, I think with Singapore, I think the big overriding lessons there are low tax, low regulation, and a place that is incredibly business friendly, and you can generate wealth and so on. And I think that's the override. There are things to learn from other countries. I've said what I've said about the Triple Lock and our commitment to it, and pensions, and that's basically where we are on that. So I don't think I can comment any more on that. Yeah.
Okay. More questions. We'll go over here for a bit if that's okay. I think the gentleman there, Emma, that's the fella. Thank you.
Hi, Marissa Allen-Carr from City. My first question is, was taxing non-DOMs a mistake in Jeremy Hunt's last few budgets? And separately, Reform have suggested they would scrap the OBR. What changes to the OBR should be on the table on the Tory policy agenda? Thank you.
Okay, so on the non-DOMs point, let me just answer it this way. To have got into a situation where I think we've got this drain of a number of wealth creators, I think we should worry about that. Most of them worry about inheritance tax in terms of the current arrangements on worldwide assets and so on. And I just think that those are things we need to think about. On the issue of the OBR, no, I do not think that it should be abolished. But in answer to your question as to how it might be reformed or changed, I do think there are issues around the OBR having the time and resource to fully assess the impact of some interventions which are relatively innovative and therefore in their current arrangement, by virtue of their current arrangements, are difficult for them to score. So what I found at DWP was if you went to the OBR and you said, we have done X, Y, and Z for the last X years, and we're going to do more of it, they'll say, oh, yes, okay, fine, we've got the data on that, and we'll give you this kind of impact on the labour market or whatever it may be. If you went to them and actually, probably more appropriately, said, we've done X, Y, and Z for the last X years, and actually it's not really working, so we're going to do something very different, okay? And we think it's going to make a big change. We've got all the arguments as to why it's going to make a big change. They will say, well, we have no evidence of the fact that this actually works, and therefore we won't give you much of it by way of labour market impact for it, for example. And I think that is probably a function of the OBR's ability to look across the globe, to look at other systems and have the time to do that. So if I was looking for improvements to the OBR, I would be looking at their ability to more accurately score some of those more innovative interventions. But the reason why I don't think we should get rid of the OBR is because I do think there's huge value in having an independent body mark the Chancellor's homework. The alternative is, or the most obvious alternative, is that the Chancellor of the Treasury decide whether these fiscal targets are going to be hit or not. And I think you probably in the bond markets would carry a bit of a risk premium on that, because I think the markets would look at those numbers and think that they might not be as solid as if they were independently assessed figures. And that would be a direct cost in terms of interest rates and servicing costs and so on. And people sometimes say, oh, the OBR is running the economy, not the Chancellor. It's not true. They are the forecaster, and they make an assessment of whether a target will be hit. The Chancellor is the person that takes all the other decisions, including setting the target and the headroom. So I think the OBR is an important part of the architecture. That's not saying the same thing as saying that it's perfect or it shouldn't be changed in some ways.
Okay. We'll take a couple more questions. Yeah, over here, please. Sorry. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for your time. I wanted to come back to some of the causes of where we're at in terms of the economy. You mentioned that it's suffering as a result of COVID, the legacy of the 2010 inheritance, the mini-budget. The OBR predicts that the UK post-Brexit arrangements will result in a 4% long-term reduction in productivity compared to remaining in the EU. To what extent, in your mind, has Brexit negatively impacted the economy?
So what we've got to do is, I'm not going to rehearse all the arguments around Brexit. We have got to go out there and embrace the additional freedoms that we have got around Brexit. I'm not convinced that we've fully embraced those, but one of those is clearly trade deals with other countries, some of which have been entered into and achieved. And I think we have to constantly now be looking forward rather than thinking about, what would have been better. The British people made their choice. That should be respected, and that's really all I have to say.
We'll take another question. Somewhere over here. I think, Madam, is that, I can't see. Yeah, Madam, thank you. Lovely green jacket.
According to the think tanks and the Grangos I've been speaking to, the self-employed people do not earn any money. They have said that the tax gap between the self-employed and the employed is too large. They want to reduce the VAT threshold on small businesses significantly. Now, I run a cafe. I employ people. I am a micro business. We seem to be very underrepresented at this place. There aren't many of us. And I would like to see a micro business minister so that we are represented. We are 1.16 million people who employ staff. We're a total of 5.5 million when you include the self-employed, and we have no voice. We have things foisted on us that make it very, very difficult to trade. And quite frankly, if we all were able to employ one extra person, we'd solve your unemployment problem. If we were able to make some money, you'd end up with a lot more tax. We could grow easily if we weren't being so slaughtered. Can we have a micro business minister, please?
Okay. So, at the risk of being unpopular, I'm not going to commit today to a micro business minister, I'm afraid, but I do think micro businesses matter, those businesses up to 10 employees or less, and I think their voice is very important for the reasons that you have given. I hear what you say about VAT. There are issues around VAT and the threshold and bunching just below the threshold and so on, and there are some people that say the threshold should go altogether and others that say it should be higher and so on. What I would say, though, is that what I said yesterday in my speech was that we would be abolishing business rates for shops, including cafes in high streets. Okay. It might help you, given that there's not an election for 4 years and these reliefs that are built into the system are being taken away, and I wouldn't mind betting that by the time of the next election you will be paying business rates. But let's see. I'm saying, with me, with Mel, you won't, okay? So I think that's about. The other thing is national insurance costs, and yeah, okay, so you'll get the employment allowance that probably more than compensates for it. But more generally with SMEs, that's obviously an important point. But I think business rates. But look, to your point about micro businesses mattering, absolutely. You know, my background is I set up my own business in the 1980s, actually. And I did it working from the kitchen table, from the ground up. And I started with, 1 or 2 people and grew it to quite a few more than that. And I took it to America and I grew a business there. And those kind of things. So I know the journey that, when I started, I was at the micro level. So I do get it. And I think the comfort that you should take is that a future Conservative government will not be populated by people who have no experience of business, which is why they're taking the wrong decisions in the Labour government, but will be people like myself who have grown businesses from scratch, and we get it.
I'm afraid we're out of time. I'm really sorry, but thank you for your questions, and thank you everyone for attending. You've been a great audience. Thank you very much. Thank you to John O'Connell, Chief Executive of the Taxpayers Alliance, and also to Mel Stride, Shadow Chancellor. Please show your appreciation.
Thank you.
And can I just take this opportunity to thank all of the staff here in the think tent, some fantastic sound guys and lighting guys, thank you, and the security as well. And thank you all of the Taxpayers Alliance team for the smooth running of the last few days. Thank you.
Yeah, well done.
Ladies and gentlemen, have a fantastic evening, and don't forget to check out our podcast, published weekly, A Nation of Taxpayers. Thank you.